The Velhari Academy hung in the dead space between two dying stars, which the instructors said was intentional. No distractions. No light pollution from living systems. Just the cold geometry of learning. Cadet Mira Solano had been staring at the back of the same gray chair for 11 weeks, and she had memorized every scratch on it. She was the only human in Cohort 7. Not the only biological. There were 3 Velhari, 2 Dasic, and a Pren named Chas who communicated entirely through color shifts in his outer membrane. But she was the only one who had arrived carrying a single duffel bag, wearing worn boots, and who had needed 3 separate orientation sessions just to understand how the gravity controls worked. The Velhari were tall and angular, built like question marks made of pale cartilage and precision. They did not use names the way humans did. They used frequency signatures, low harmonic hums that identified them uniquely. Mira couldn't produce those sounds, so her assigned instructor, the one she internally called Professor Hinge because of the way his upper joints moved, had given her a small translation pendant that converted human speech into acceptable approximation.
It helped about 60% of the time.
The other 40%, she just nodded and hoped. Today was Earth lesson. Mira had been dreading it for 3 weeks, ever since she saw it on the curriculum schedule. She knew what Earth lessons usually were in alien academic settings. She had read the briefings from the First Contact Liaison Bureau before she left. Earth lessons were anthropological deep dives that other species conducted to understand humanity, and they were almost always wrong in ways that were both deeply insulting and somehow deeply sad. She had braced herself. Professor Hinge stood at the front of the long obsidian table that served as both classroom and experimental surface. Above him, a holographic rendering of Earth rotated slowly. It was accurate in shape. In everything else, it was a disaster. The oceans were labeled chemical interference zones. The continents were color-coded by what appeared to be soil toxicity ratings. The atmosphere was rendered in a sickly orange that suggested the Academy's database had pulled climate data from sometime around 2041, which had not been Earth's best year. The other cadets were already seated. Liz, the senior Velhari cadet, had her scanner resting on the table in front of her like a student who had already done the reading. Chas was cycling through a calm pale blue. The Dasic twins, Rael and Forn, were sharing a data tablet in their quiet, synchronized way that always made Mira feel like she was watching one person pretend to be 2. Mira sat down at her usual seat, third from the left, near the ventilation panel that ran slightly warm, which she had discovered in week 1 was the only spot in the room that didn't make her feel like she was slowly freezing from the inside out. Professor Hinge began. "The human species," he said, in his precise, clicking Velhari, which the pendant translated with a half-second delay, represents one of the most extensively documented biological anomalies in the known enrollment registry. They are fragile by measurable standards. Their sensory range is narrow. Their communication relies heavily on a single-frequency sound channel with limited bandwidth. Mira folded her hands on the table. "And yet," Hinge continued, pulling up a data stream beside the rotating Earth, "they consistently produce outcomes that registered models fail to predict. The Academy has been attempting to understand this discrepancy for 43 cycles." Liz glanced sideways at Mira, with a particular Velhari expression that meant something between clinical interest and very contained skepticism. Mira had learned to read that expression in week 2. It appeared often. "Today's lesson," Hinge said, "will involve direct observational testing. We will examine baseline human sensory response under controlled conditions." He reached beneath the table and placed a device at the center of the obsidian surface. Mira recognized it immediately, which surprised her, because she had never seen one before, not in person. But she had read the technical documents during her transit to the Academy. It was a Velhari calibration scanner. Specifically, it was a Class 4 resonance reader, used for measuring biological signal output in organic subjects. It was, in the documents, described as non-invasive, passive. It simply read. It didn't emit anything, except that the one Hinge placed on the table had a secondary housing attached to its base that was not in any documentation Mira had ever read. A small, matte black cylinder, no longer than her finger, with a seam along one side that suggested it could open. She looked at it. Then she looked at Hinge. He was already moving on, pulling up a chart that compared human neural response data to Valhari baseline measurements. Mira looked back at the device. The seam on the cylinder was vibrating, very slightly, at a frequency she shouldn't have been able to perceive because it was, technically, below human auditory range, and yet she could feel it in her back teeth the way she used to feel the bass from the speakers at her sister's apartment on Friday nights when she was 17 and the whole building hummed. She knew that feeling. She knew what it meant. Something was building pressure. The chart Professor Hinge was displaying showed a comparison between human and Valhari neural response latency. Valhari, the chart indicated, processed external stimuli in 0.003 seconds. The human baseline, drawn from the Academy's dataset, was listed at 0.24 seconds. Liss made a sound that, in Valhari frequency language, translated roughly to as expected. Rail and Forn glanced at the chart, and then at Mira with what she had come to understand was Dosic courtesy, the slight forward lean that meant we are not making this about you personally. Mira appreciated that. She also kept her eyes on the cylinder. The human nervous system, Hinge continued, compensates for its latency through a mechanism the Academy has classified as pattern aggregation under stress, or PAUS. In high-threat environments, humans appear to draw on nonlinear associative processing that temporarily accelerates response. He tapped the data stream. We do not fully understand the trigger mechanism. Has it been reproduced in controlled conditions? Liss asked. 17 attempts, Hinge said. All inconclusive. Mira said quietly, "You need to turn that off." The room didn't stop, not immediately. Hinge continued a half-syllable before the pendant caught up and broadcast her words in proper Valhari frequency. Then the room stopped. Hinge turned. Cadet Solano. "The secondary housing on the scanner," Mira said. She kept her voice level. She had learned, in 11 weeks, that showing urgency to Valhari before they had verified the reason for urgency was counterproductive. They did not respond to emotional escalation. They responded to information. It's pressurizing. I can feel the harmonic buildup. I think there's a plasma containment issue. The room was very quiet. Liss looked at the device. Then at Mira. Human sensory range does not include. I know what the chart says, Mira said. Hinge looked at the device. He was still, in the way Valhari went still when they were running internal calculations, not frozen, just rerouted. The scanner was certified this morning, he said. I believe you, Mira said. I also think the secondary housing wasn't part of the original certification, and I think whoever attached it didn't account for the ambient temperature differential near the ventilation panel. She paused. Which is where the device is sitting. Another silence. Then the scanner's surface flickered. It was a small flicker. The kind that, in any device, in any context, in any species' technological tradition, meant something is wrong. Hinge moved toward it. Don't, Mira said. He stopped. The cylinder seam had opened 2 millimeters. A thin line of deep violet light was visible along the gap, not the soft violet of Valhari display tech, but a hard, saturated violet that ate the light around it. Plasma violet. Contained plasma, fighting the containment. Mira understood plasma shots from her Academy intake reading. Uncontrolled plasma discharge from a Class 4 scanner was non-lethal to Valhari. Their cartilage-dense physiology absorbed and dispersed the energy. The discharge would hurt them, briefly, and damage equipment. For a human body, the conductivity math was entirely different. She was the one sitting closest to the ventilation panel. She was the one closest to the device. She had approximately 4 seconds, by her estimation, before the seam opened fully. She had been estimating since she first felt the vibration in her teeth. She picked up the scanner. The thing about 4 seconds is that they are simultaneously nothing and everything. Mira had grown up in Tucson, Arizona, where summer storms rolled in from the mountains with almost no warning, and the air pressure dropped so fast your ears popped. Her father had taught her, not formally, just through repetition, to read the sky. Not the color of it, the weight of it, the way it pressed down differently before lightning than before rain. The sky doesn't announce itself, he used to say. You have to already be listening. She was already listening. She grabbed the scanner with her left hand, Not by the body, which would have put her palm over the seam, but by the far edge, thumb and forefinger only, the way you pick up something hot when you have no choice and no gloves, minimizing contact surface. She turned the cylinder away from the populated side of the table in the same motion, pointed it toward the room's far wall, which was reinforced obsidian composite. She had learned that in week 3 during the structural orientation that she had attended alone because none of the other cadets needed it. The seam split. The shot came out sideways, a flat, wide pulse of contained plasma that would have dispersed across the entire table length if the cylinder had been horizontal. Because Mira had rotated it, the pulse went in a narrow column toward the far wall. It hit the wall. The wall absorbed it. A small black scorch mark, about the size of her hand, appeared on the composite surface. Then it was over. Mira set the scanner back down on the table, carefully, with the cylinder now fully vented and inert. Her left hand was shaking. Not from fear, exactly, more from the specific biological response to having used herself as a variable in a very fast calculation. She pressed her palm flat on the table to stop the shaking. She looked up. Every cadet had gone silent. Not the polite silence of a classroom. Not the silence of surprise. This was the particular silence of people who had just watched something happen that did not fit inside the categories they used to organize the world. Lys's scanner, the personal one she kept on the table, was still running. Mira could see the readout from where she sat. The response latency number on Lys's screen was not 0.24 seconds. It was 0.019. Professor Hinge was standing exactly where he had stopped when Mira said don't. He had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a Velhari face before, and she had spent 11 weeks cataloging their expressions because she had nothing else to do on the nights when she couldn't sleep. She didn't have a name for this one yet. She would need to invent one. They called it a safety review, which was the Academy's term for we are going to sit in a smaller room and ask questions until we understand what just happened. The smaller room was adjacent to the main classroom. It had the same obsidian walls. It was colder. Mira sat across from Hinge with no table between them, which was unusual. Velhari preferred the ritual formality of surface barriers during formal conversation. The absence felt significant. Chas was present, which surprised her. He sat in the corner, his membrane cycling through a slow pattern she hadn't seen before, a deep amber threaded with narrow lines of silver. Later she would look it up. It meant witness. The secondary housing, Hinge said, was not Academy equipment. I know, Mira said. It was added to the scanner during transfer from the equipment bay. We are investigating how. Mira nodded. What I need to understand, Hinge said, and he said it in a way that was careful, the Velhari version of careful, which was different from human careful but she had learned to recognize it, is the detection mechanism you used. The certification process for that scanner includes 3 separate resonance checks. None of them identified the fault. Because the fault wasn't in the scanner, Mira said. It was in the interaction between the cylinder and the room temperature near the vent. The certification happened in the equipment bay. Different temperature. Different pressure gradient. The cylinder was stable during certification. Hinge was quiet for a moment. You identified a multivariable environmental interaction in a system you had never seen before in under 2 minutes, using sensory input that should not have been within your biological detection range. My detection range isn't where your dataset says it is, Mira said. Clearly. It's not a special ability, she said, and she said it because she knew how this was going to be written in the report if she didn't. It's not that my species is unusual. It's that your dataset was built from intake assessments, controlled rooms, single variables. Those tests don't measure what humans can do in context. They measure what we do when there's nothing to actually sense. Hinge tilted his upper joint slightly. Explain. Mira thought about how to say it. She had been trying to explain this to herself for 11 weeks, in the dark of her quarters, listening to the ventilation hum, and missing her father, and trying to figure out why she was here, and what she was supposed to contribute to a school full of beings who were, by every metric the Academy used, better at everything. Your sensory systems are precision instruments, she said. They read specific frequencies, specific ranges, very accurately. She paused. Human senses are bad at precision. We can't hear as far or see as sharply or process signals as fast. But we don't read the world in ranges. We read it in gestalts. Wholes. Everything at once, all mixed together, and we look for what's wrong in the mixture. My father taught me to read weather by feel. Not by measurement. Just by the way the whole thing felt different. Hinge was very still. The cylinder vibrated below my hearing range, she said. But it also changed the air pressure by a small amount. And the light near the vent shifted slightly because of the heat interaction. And the table surface conducted a faint tremor. None of those things, alone, are detectable by human senses. But all of them together, at the same time, with the wrong pattern, I felt that something was wrong before I could have told you specifically what.
She stopped.
Your species, Hinge said slowly, developed a threat detection system based on accumulated environmental dissonance rather than specific signal identification. I never heard it put that way, Mira said. But yes, I think so. Chas, in the corner, shifted from amber and silver to something Mira had no word for, a color that sat between green and gold, threaded now with deep red. She would look that one up too. It meant this changes the shape of the question. Liz came to Myra's quarters that evening without announcement, which was unusual. Velhari observed arrival protocols. You signaled before you approached. You did not simply appear at a door. Mira opened the door and Liz was standing there, holding her personal scanner the way humans hold objects when they're not sure whether to offer them or keep them. May I come in? Liz asked. Her pendant translated it in a clean, flat tone that gave no indication of what she was feeling, but Mira had stopped relying on pendant translations for Liz about 4 weeks ago. She read the posture instead. The angle of the upper joints. The slight lowering of the cranial ridge that she had catalogued as something I am not fully comfortable with, but am choosing to do anyway. Sure, Mira said and stepped back. Liz entered and stood in the middle of the small room looking at it the way Velhari looked at things. Comprehensively, like running a scan. Myra's duffel bag in the corner. The image of the Tucson mountains she had printed on paper and attached to the wall with adhesive because she couldn't interface with the Academy's display systems. The spare jacket folded over the chair. You read my scanner output, Liz said. Your latency readout, yeah. During the after. 0.019 seconds. Liz set her scanner on the small table beside the door. The Academy baseline for human response is 0.24. That number has been in our database for 31 cycles. I know. It is wrong. It's measuring the wrong thing, Mira said. There's a difference. Liz made a sound that wasn't quite a frequency name and wasn't quite anything else. It was the first non-categorical sound Mira had ever heard her make. I have been in Cohort 7 for 3 full cycles, she said. I have observed 11 exchange cadets from 11 species. I have written assessments of their capabilities for the Academy performance record. Mira waited. I wrote your preliminary assessment in week 1, Liz said. I figured. It did not account for. The cranial ridge lowered again. Further this time. This was, Mira realized, the Velhari equivalent of someone taking a breath before saying something they had been rehearsing. I do not have a framework for what you did today. I have been attempting to construct one for the past 4 hours, and I cannot. And I came here because I thought, she stopped. You thought I might have a framework, Mira said. Yes. Mira sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the printed mountains on her wall for a moment. Then she looked back at Liz. I don't have a framework either, she said. I just knew. And knowing without a framework it's something humans are very uncomfortable with, actually. We spend a lot of time trying to build the framework after the fact, so we don't have to admit that we just felt it was wrong. Liz was quiet for a long time. That sounds, she said finally, very inefficient. It is, Mira said. And yet, Mira agreed. Liz picked her scanner back up from the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Mira with an expression that was, Mira realized it was new. She had not catalogued this one. What does it feel like, Liz asked, when you know before you know? And Mira told her. 3 days after the classroom incident, the Academy's internal investigation identified the source of the secondary housing. It had been placed by a Velhari senior faculty member named, in frequency translation, something that Myra's pendant rendered as Instructor Sile. Sile ran the Academy's Performance Evaluation Division. He had attached the cylinder to the scanner the night before the Earth lesson, using override access that was the investigation found, not sanctioned but also not technically prohibited because no protocol had ever been written to prohibit it. He was called before the Academy Council. Mira was not present for that meeting, but Hinge told her the outcome the following morning. Instructor Sile, Hinge said, had been attempting to resolve the Paus question. The 43 failed attempts to reproduce human stress response acceleration in controlled conditions were, in large part, his research. Mira stared at him. He manufactured a threat scenario to test the effect. Yes. He put a plasma device in a classroom with 8 cadets. He had calculated that the discharge would be non-lethal to Velhari physiology, Hinge said. He did not fully account for your presence. His model used the Academy's baseline human data. 0.24 seconds. The wrong number. The number that had made her, in Sile's calculation, slow enough that the plasma shot would have already dispersed before reaching her. A margin of error, in his model, that was wide enough to feel safe. Except his model was wrong. And she had been sitting closest to the vent. And she had felt the vibration in her back teeth. What happens to him? Mira asked. He has been suspended from active instruction. There will be a formal review. Mira nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he wanted to understand something real. He just went about it in the worst possible way. Hinge tilted his upper joint. You are not angry with him. I'm angry with him, she said. I understand the impulse. 43 failed tests, and you've got the real variable sitting right there in your classroom every week. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. It doesn't make it okay. It just makes it human. You use that phrase, Hinge said. You say it just makes it human when you mean something is understandable but flawed. I guess I do. It is an interesting construction. We have a lot of sayings like that, Mira said. We've had a long time to make peace with being understandable but flawed. Chas had not spoken to Mira, not directly, not using his membrane-to-translator system, in all 11 weeks of the cohort. The Pren communicated through color, and the Academy's translation tech converted it into text rendered on a small screen that Chas carried. But Chas had never directed that screen toward Mira before. He found her in the observation deck 3 days after the investigation concluded. She went there sometimes when she couldn't sleep, which was often. The observation deck faced the dead space between the dying stars, and she had found, unexpectedly, that looking at nothing was easier than looking at holograms of places she knew. Chas sat beside her. His membrane was cycling in that slow amber gold-red pattern she had now looked up multiple times and still felt she didn't fully understand. He held out his translator screen. It read, "You did not tell them the whole thing." Mira looked at the screen, then at Chas. "No," she said. The screen refreshed. The cylinder. You knew what it was before you felt it. You recognized the housing shape. Mira was quiet for a long time. I read the technical documents on my transit here, she said. 30 hours of travel. I read everything they gave me about Velhari technology because I knew I was going to be behind, and I wanted to close the gap as much as I could. I'd seen a diagram of a Class 4 scanner. Not the modified version, but close enough. So part of it was knowledge. Part of it was knowledge, she said. And part of it was the thing I told Hinge, the environmental dissonance the Gestalt read.
Both.
At the same time.
She paused.
If I had just felt something was wrong without knowing what to look for, I might have taken longer. If I had only recognized the housing without feeling the vibration, I might have waited to say something because I wasn't sure. It took both. It took both. The screen was still for a moment. Then, why did you not say this? Mira thought about the safety review, about Hinge's careful questions and the shape of the report that would come from them, about Lys's assessment in week 1 that she had written without a framework. Because, she said slowly, if I tell them it was partly knowledge that I studied on the transit ship because I was scared of being left behind, then the story becomes she prepared well. And they'll update the protocols. Test for preparation. Add a knowledge assessment module to intake. She looked at the dead space between the stars. But if it's the other thing, the dissonance detection, the pattern aggregation, the thing none of their tests can measure, then the question is still open. And open questions get studied. And if my species gets studied correctly for once. She stopped. You stayed quiet to protect the question. I stayed quiet to protect the question, she said. Chaucer's membrane shifted. She watched the colors move, amber and gold and red, and then something new, a deep, resonant blue that spread from his center outward like a stone dropped in still water. She looked it up later. The Pren dictionary had 17 distinct entries for that particular shade of blue. All of them translated, with variations, as, I see you clearly now. 7 weeks later, Hinch published a paper through the Academy's research network. Mira read it in her quarters, on the small screen above her desk, with her coffee going cold beside her, real coffee, from the small supplies she'd brought in her duffel bag and rationed carefully. The paper was titled, Environmental Dissonance Aggregation as Adaptive Threat Detection, a re-examination of human sensory baselines and the limitations of single-variable assessment methodologies. She read it twice. It was careful and technical and written in Velhari academic language that her pendant rendered with that familiar half-second delay, but the core of it was clear. The baseline was wrong. The tests had been wrong. Not because humanity was exceptional, Hinge was careful about that, specific about it, but because the tests had been designed to find precision and had therefore found only imprecision, which they had recorded as limitation. He had also included, in the appendix, a note. It read, in translation, the author acknowledges that this paper owes its foundational observation to a cadet who noticed an anomaly in a secondary housing cylinder at a temperature differential of 11 degrees, while also knowing the rough shape of what to look for, while also being afraid, and who acted in the synthesis of all three before any single one of them was complete. This is not a human ability. This is a description of how integrated knowledge functions when it has somewhere real to land. We have been testing the parts. We have not been testing the whole. Mira sat with that for a long time. The coffee was completely cold. The Tucson mountains were on the wall. Outside the observation port, the dying stars continued their slow, ancient collapse. She thought about her father reading the sky. She thought about 30 hours on a transit ship, reading documents alone because she was scared. She thought about Liz coming to her door holding a scanner, like a question. She thought about Chauce and his deep resonant blue. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway, because that was also a human thing, the willingness to finish what you started even when the temperature was wrong. On the first day of the new academic cycle, Cohort 8 arrived at the Velhari Academy. Mira was there not as a cadet anymore but as a second-tier research assistant, which was a role the Academy had created specifically for the situation because no existing category fit. Hinge had offered it to her the week before, with the kind of formal Velhari directness that she had come to understand, over the months, was its own kind of warmth. Cohort 8 had 12 cadets. 3 Velhari. 2 Dosic. A Pren, not Chauce, who had graduated and returned to his home system, but a younger one whose membranes cycled in quick, nervous bursts of pale yellow. A Sorith, a species Mira hadn't worked with before, who had 4 arms and the careful, measured movements of someone who had spent a long time learning not to break things. 2 others she was still learning to read. And 1 human. A young man from Portland named Daniel who had arrived with a single bag, smaller even than hers had been, and who had needed 4 orientation sessions instead of 3, and who had stood at the observation deck on the first night looking at the dead space between the stars with an expression she recognized completely. She found him there the second evening. She didn't start with the technical documents or the academy protocols or the things that would matter later. She started with something her father had said in a specific way because it had taken her an entire academic cycle to understand that it was the thing she had needed to know first. The first thing, she said, is that you're going to be behind on the metrics they're measuring. That's real, and it's going to matter, and you need to know it. Daniel nodded. He was holding the railing of the observation deck with both hands. The second thing, she said, is that the metrics they're measuring aren't all the metrics. And the ones they're missing are the ones you've been using your whole life, without knowing they were anything. He looked at her. And the third thing, she said, is that those two facts are not a contradiction. Being behind on their scales and ahead on ones they haven't built yet, both things are true at the same time. And sitting with that without collapsing it into a simpler story it's actually one of the things we're good at. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How do you know which ones we're ahead on if they haven't been measured yet? Mira smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that takes time to grow. 11 weeks of a cycle and 7 more weeks of research work and cold coffee and the slow, careful work of building language with people who use frequencies she couldn't produce. You pay attention, she said, to everything. All at once. The whole shape of the thing, not just the readable signals. She looked out at the dead space. Your dad teach you anything? She asked. Daniel thought about it. My grandmother, actually. She used to say she could tell when a storm was coming 3 days out. Not from any weather report. Just from the way the air felt. Yeah, Mira said. I never knew how she did it. I think, Mira said, that's exactly the point. The two dying stars continued their slow collapse at the edge of nothing. Between them, the academy hung in patient dark, full of beings trying to build large enough frameworks to hold small, essential truths. And in a room with obsidian walls, a scanner sat on a table, repaired, recertified, with no secondary housing, waiting for the next lesson. The lesson that had already changed.